What were Africans worshipping before the coming of colonization? And was something interrupted when colonization came? And what would we be if colonization had not come? Welcome to Bisrat for Africa, a channel dedicated to giving you Christian commentary on religious and spiritual matters. This was a question that was posed by Bishop Maponga to Rorisang in the second episode of the Black Conversations. And this is going to be part 2 of my response to the initial video. And if you haven't watched my response to the first episode, I'll encourage you to find the link in the description box, and it'll help you better understand this video that we're going to make now. So what were Africans worshipping before the coming of colonization? These are very important questions, and I think it's very important that we have these discussions in proximity so that we can better understand each other. So let's get into the video, and then I'm going to give my commentary.
Can I add a statement to that?
Yeah.
Had the colonialists not come here, what would you be?
I don't know.
Exactly.
I don't know.
Hold on,
I don't know.
hold on.
Yes, sir.
Don't claim ignorance.
I mustn't claim ignorance.
Follow culture.
Okay.
Was there no interruption?
So the argument here, sir, is you want me to...
No. Hear me.
No, I cannot.
I'm asking you a question,
Yes,
but I want you
sir.
to follow me carefully. There's a path you were walking on.
I wasn't alive. I was walking on no path.
But remember,
I wasn't here to experience it. It's not my
You
path.
are your ancestors.
You don't know
I'm
the
not
future.
your ancestors.
No.
They
I
make you.
come from them.
Their DNA is in you.
God bless them for that.
You are your ancestors.
But who called
You
me
are your
to it?
children's ancestor.
Me.
Yes. When you die, your children will refer to you as
I
an ancestor.
pray that they find their maker.
Hold on a minute.
Yes.
Hold on a minute.
More than their ancestor, I pray that
The
they find their
DNA
maker.
that plants in them.
Sir, I agree
is-
with you. I'm
is in
saying
you.
for me personally.
Sometimes being a Christian.
Can you give each other chances, please?
That's fine.
No,
it's
my
fine.
risk can't tell
Let's have fun.
because I haven't called
Let's have
anybody.
fun.
I've been called schizophrenic. I've been called
Let's have fun. Let's have
because
fun.
I have a faith point.
You're on a path. You're on a path. Was there no interruption, which was a colonial interruption, which diverted your path into this newly found Islamic Christianity way of expression? Had nature been left the way it was,
Can I say this?
had Father Merve not come and 1640 what had not happened,
56.
Can I say this?
what would you be?
There you have it, guys. Those were the questions that were asked by Bishop Maponga to Rorisang. And of course, Rorisang is somebody who is standing up against the culture, and she's really waving the Christian flag in our country. But it's very important that you understand that when we are here defending the truthfulness of Christianity, we're not here to defend colonization. We're not here to defend any form of racial superiority of one race to another. And we think that those things go against the values and the teaching of the Bible. And so those things are condemned in Scripture. Sho Baraka, who is a Christian hip-hop artist, once tweeted that African history does not begin with slavery or colonization in our context. But why is it that every time somebody talks about the history of Africa, it must always come or begin with slavery? Because slavery is actually only 1% of the history of Africa. And guess what? It's only probably 10% of the history of Christianity. But why do people always want to define both with slavery and colonization? And so I think it's important when we're having these discussions to first begin to remove the chains of the African and say we're not defined by slavery, we're not defined by colonization, and therefore we can have these discussions without colonization being the defining factor. We can go a bit further back in the history of Africa, and we can also go a bit further back in the history of Christianity. Because as far back as you can go, there's an African proclaiming that Jesus is Lord. In fact, Jacob Olupona, who is a professor of indigenous African religions at the Harvard Divinity School, he says that Christianity has been present in Africa almost as long as it has actually existed. And so he even goes on to say that Christianity cannot be considered as a foreign belief because there are actually some other African indigenous beliefs that are much younger than Christianity.
Stuff. But I don't understand. I mean, we've been having it.
Now here's a very interesting fact. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia 1,500 years before the coming of colonization and slavery. What about Nubia? 1,300 years before the coming of colonization. And even more interesting is the fact that Christianity arrived in Ethiopia 400 years before it actually arrived in places like England? Or what about the Dutch settlers that came to South Africa? When did Christianity arrive in Holland? Only 600 years after it arrived in Ethiopia.
You see? We've been having it.
How do we know all of this? Because there are manuscripts or books that were written by early church fathers that can be traced back to those times. There's also church buildings that we can look at that can also be dated in those times. In fact, recently, there was an excavation of one of the oldest churches in the world that was excavated in Ethiopia. In fact, Ethiopia was the second country in the whole entire world to make Christianity a state religion. And so this is African history. And somebody once said, if you study the history of Africa, you actually study the history of Christianity. And if you study the history of Christianity, you study the history of Africa as well, because the two are so intertwined. And so it's important that we go beyond the colonial narrative. It's important that we go beyond the slavery narrative and see what were Africans actually doing before the coming of colonization. Now, of course, I'm not saying Africans were all Christians before the coming of colonization. Absolutely not. But what I'm saying is that there were Christians who were African back in those times. And just like there were Christians all over the world in places like India and so on that believed in Christ as well. And so I'm not making a case that Africans actually believed only in Christianity, but that we were also Christians before the coming of colonization. Now, it's important that you understand that Africans were not just spectators in the early church. They weren't just people who were being told what they should believe. But in fact, the theological and intellectual roots of Christianity for the first 300 years of the church are actually in Africa. In fact, most of the church fathers, most of the most prominent scholars ever in the history of Christianity actually come from the continent of Africa. And these scholars actually helped the whole church to articulate some complex doctrines that are in the Bible. Like, for an example, the doctrine of the Trinity. It was actually an African bishop called Tertullian who was able to teach and articulate and coin the term Trinity. And what about the divinity of Jesus? Did Africans believe that Jesus was divine before the coming of colonization? Or is this just a Western idea? Absolutely, Africans believed in it. In fact, there's a church father called Athanasius who stood and fought for the belief that Jesus was divine. In fact, he said that the scriptures affirmed the divinity of Jesus and that by the coming of Jesus to the world, it was actually God coming in the flesh. But there were opposing views at the time. In fact, there was a bishop also called Arius who was from the church in Alexandria who actually didn't believe that Jesus was divine. He believed that Jesus was a created being. He believed that Jesus was only a created being and not equal to the Father. And so there was these two schools of thought in the church in Africa that were split over whether Jesus was divine or not. And now back in those days, the church in Africa was so prominent that if two schools of thought from an African church were opposing each other or were in conflict, the whole church actually felt it. And because of the split, the whole church was actually split into two. And then you then had the Council of Nicaea that was convened in order to settle this dispute. But what I'm trying to make the point is that Africans stood and fought for orthodoxy, even when Europeans were not clear on whether Jesus was divine. Like, did the scriptures affirm he was or not? It was an African church father that stood for orthodoxy. So Africans were not just spectators in the early church, but actually they were very much involved. And some can actually argue that they were at the forefront of the development of Christianity. In fact, it's said that the most prominent scholar after the Apostle Paul is actually a church father called Augustine. And he was from North Africa. And he would go to Europe and teach Europeans Christian theology. You look at scholars like Athanasius, and he would go to Europe and teach Christian theology to Europeans. Athanasius would go to Europe and teach Europeans the doctrine of the Trinity. And so before the missionaries actually brought Christianity or came to us with Christianity, we were the ones that actually went to Europe and brought Christianity and taught Christianity to them. This means that when they brought Christianity to us, they weren't bringing something new. They weren't bringing something that we didn't know, but actually they were reminding us of what we had already known, that Jesus Christ is Lord, that God is a Trinity. All these things were things that Africans knew before the Europeans actually came. And in fact, we actually went to them. And so the question should be then for Bishop Maponga, what would they be if Athanasius didn't go and teach them the Trinity? What would they be if Augustine didn't go? Those are the questions that we need to be asking, because if you think about it, European Christianity wouldn't be what it is today if it wasn't for the coming of African Christian scholars. But something very interesting is happening today. We see in Europe that the fastest growing religion is actually paganism. It's a religion or religious system that they used to believe in before the coming of Christianity. And so the same movement that we're seeing in Africa, where Africans are saying, let's go back to what we used to originally believe in before the coming of Christianity, Europeans are also saying, well, Christianity is actually not our original belief system, and they're going back to paganism as well. But a very interesting thing is that we're now seeing that the majority of Christians in the world are actually living in Africa, in the continent of Africa, in the global south. And so initially Christianity started in the south, and then it moved to the north. And then people in the north, played a part in bringing it to the south as well, although they weren't actually bringing it, but they were reminding us. But what we're seeing today is that it is actually African Christians who are now taking the gospel to Europe. And Europeans have moved away from the gospel, and they also need to be reminded. The biggest church in Ukraine today is actually led by an African man called Sunday Adeleje. And in his church, he has 30% of people who are in the parliament of Kiev are actually coming to his church. In fact, the mayor of Kiev is in his church. In fact, 80% of his congregation is actually white people. And his church is also making an impact in politics. It's making an impact in the daily lives of people in Ukraine. And they feed people, they educate people, and they're running social programs. And so God is now using Africans to impact Europeans, and we are now reminding them of what Christianity is, who Jesus Christ is. And so going back to answering what Bishop Maponga, when he was asking if something was interrupted when colonization actually came, of course colonization was wrong. But if Christianity is true, Rorisang needs to actually embrace Christianity. Because if you think about it, we can't just believe in something just because our forefathers used to believe in it. Because you can't always follow your traditions. I mean, here in the Eastern Cape where I'm living, we've got a problem of young boys who are now actually always ending up in the hospitals because they've gotten into fights. If somebody goes to a nearby village and they're not part of that village, they get attacked. And when they are asked, why are you doing this? And most of these boys say, our forefathers used to do this, and therefore we're also doing it. So you see in this case, following on the footsteps of your forefathers is actually not right. Let me give you another example. On the other side of the river, you might have a young white male thinking, my forefathers used to oppress Africans. They used to subjugate Africans. Should he follow in the footsteps of his forefathers, or should he change when he's confronted with the truth? And so I think that if something is true, it calls for us to believe in it. All of us must be willing to change our cultures and traditions whenever we are confronted with the truth. And so whenever somebody comes up to you and asks you, what did Africans actually believe in before the coming of Christianity? What are you going to say?
We've been having it!